prophets. Now there's 12 of them. They're all singing in a different key. But guess what? We're going to blend them all together, and we're going to have a harmonious chorus out of all of this. It's one of those things we have to look at and do. But the map is there. But I wanted just to think for a minute. This, as you read your book, you find out the gift that keeps on giving. And that's what the Word of God is. It never stops. It keeps on letting us out. The reason it keeps on giving is we delve more into it and we learn more about it. And so that's what we're trying to do now is we look at these 12 voices for truth. In confronting, hearing what they're saying, you got to realize they're not in chronological order, right? Because Joel was in the 800s, all right? And we're jumping over into the 700s and on down with the rest of them. And we're going to find some of them talking about the same areas. But I wanted you to have an idea of what it is. This is a picture of what it would look like. This is Edom over here, all right? This is the area across the Jordan River. This is the southern kingdom. This is Samaria that's in the purple. And this is the northern kingdom, or Israel here. Now, they all finally come together as one nation, all right? And we're going to find out that Samaria, if you remember looking through some of this, it was wiped out by they were taken and off into captivity. So there was a lot of things there. But I wanted us to think about where we are. And I wanted to show you, here's, if you look at it and see where we are, here's Jerusalem, right? Yeah. Now, one of us, Jonah, who was from right here, was supposed to go to Nineveh. You know where Nineveh is? Let me show you.
Another map, huh?
Oh, it's got to have a large map. Because here is Nineveh. Here's Jerusalem. So you've got that distance. This is over in Assyria. And we had two prophets that prophesied to Nineveh. We all know about Jonah, all right? We know that Jonah decided he didn't want to go, so he was sitting right here, and he went and got aboard ship and took off, and the Lord says, well, we'll show you what happens here. Storm came up, and the crew threw him overboard, and the whale got him, right? And then spit him back out, so he went to Nineveh. But Nineveh is over here in Assyria. That's how far away it is. Now, if you wonder in your mind what all this is about, you see this little spot right down here? This is Ur. This is where Abraham came out of. But this area right here also is possibly where the Garden of Eden was. We don't know, but that's from the descriptions and everything. It may have been right down where the Tigris and the Euphrates are together. So, but we're going to look at this and see where we're going. I hope that you've gotten into it. We looked at the first chapter and last week got started on it. But this week we're looking at some things, and I want your thoughts. As you started looking in here on this gift that keeps on giving, how we're looking at it. We're going to look at the how, when, where, what, and why of all of this. And it's sort of like writing in journalism. How many of you took writing? And you remember had to write all those things, and so that's where we are, and we're looking at how it's going to happen. But there are a number of features that this book is great about, and as we talked about last week, you got word wealth in it, you've got behind-the-scenes scenarios, you've got things at a glance that are showing what it are. You even got a Bible extra in it. It goes beyond what we're talking about. It's a guide that will allow you and me to harvest more knowledge from the Bible. And then there's got probing the depth. And I think that's what we're going to do over these next weeks that are ahead of us, because this is quite a bit of probing we're going to do. And then we're going to find out that really and truly what they were prophesying in the 800s, 800 years before Christ, 500 years before, and so forth, how relevant it is today in the 21st century, 2,000 years plus from Christ. So we're going to look at that. But I think the authors are correct in saying that the only sources you will need is a Bible and a pencil and a piece of paper, all right, if you want that. And also a very prayerful attitude. This is going to be delving. I don't think hi Roger, I didn't see you there. You snuck in. We're going to be delving into more depth in this study of these 12 minor prophets. And so we're looking there. right off the bat today, where it said, and we're dealing with that in this, the scoop on the minor prophets, which is chapter 1, there was a comment there that I really found to be true, because I write every morning and put that out. Plus I have a weekly that I have to get out, or Brenda will let me know I'm running late, and so I get that out, and we've already done that. By the way, keep Brenda in your prayers. I sent her home yesterday. She had a blinding migraine. All right, now I've never had those things, but I understand they're horrible, and hers was extremely bad. She was better today, but so I sent her back home. We have to see. She got rid of the work that had to be done. She got the newsletter out. She got your bulletin taken care of. And hey, we got Esther there. Hello, Miss Esther. You want to see your friend? You don't want to see your friend, all right? No. Kathy Sue said she didn't want to look at you, Esther. I'm sorry. But anyway, when we're looking at this and thinking about it, in that very first paragraph on page 7, it says, whether the story is big or small, it needs to be fresh. Think about that now, all right? Because old news, like old fish, stink. And I think that's a great comment, because what you have to look at is what do you think about? It's got to be something new every day. And we wake up in a new world every day, and that's the reason I think one of the greatest things that's been an asset for me during this pandemic, and I've noticed this morning I've written 330 dailies. Whoa. Wow, I didn't realize I'd been at it this long. But when you think of it, it really and truly has to be fresh. I get tired of the same old stuff coming over, and you get that in the news a lot. And so, but it says that, and so the challenge may be is to find an angle from which an event has not been previously examined. And I think that's where we're looking at on these 12 minor prophets. We're going to see a different angle. We're going to see, y'all remember when we did the book of Revelation and we found out there God does have a wrath, all right? We know that, and we found out that Jesus came the first time as a loving one, but in the second time he comes, he's taking names and kicking our backsides pretty bad, all right? So when we look at that, so realizing what we're studying here, so we don't want to distort it. We want to see what each individual of the prophets say to us. And if you have questions, or write them down and let's kick them around, because I don't want to be the only one generating any ideas in all of this. But you've got the book, and that's going to be a big help for you. So thinking about getting the scoop, and I thought of that a while ago when I was scooping up some ice. That's what we want to scoop up a bit. So we're going to be looking at where who were these minor prophets? Where'd they come from? Why did God choose those individuals as he did? I gave you the map, which you find on page 12, that really and truly will allow you to, by the way, Esther, yours is on the way. Your book and your map is on the way to you. You got it today? Wow. Whoa, that's fast. Good. I'm glad you got it. So that's super. But looking at this and thinking where we are there on page 7, we get to looking at some things. You realize that who were they? Well, Micah does not have a passage to tell us much more than, you don't find them comparing each other very much. There is some combinations between some of them, but not a lot of them. But we're going to find out that Peter on the day of Pentecost quoted from one of these minor prophets, and we're going to get into that as we go on. But you see where they are, and they had fondness for each other type thing, but they all came at it from different places and at different times. And some of these minor prophets, they give us hints about where they are, or where they were from, or who was in charge, who was king. One of the great things we find out is that what they were about. There was no hints, though, as the author tells you, of Obadiah and Malachi. There's no hints about having any geographical hint as to where they were. Now, I know that your map shows Malachi to be out of Jerusalem, all right? We know that, but we don't find a lot about where was Obadiah and all this, because we really don't have a way of knowing. But he did throw in your map 3 of them that are not part of the 12. in your map, there is Samuel and Elisha and Elijah. All right, and you're going to see where they were and what they were about. So those are there. So we look at this and think about it. What did you think of reading that first part of Hosea?
Well, let's see, is that the one?
Yeah.
I had a question about the raisin cakes. I just don't get it.
so
Why
too.
the
About, you had a question about what?
raisin cakes?
What's
Why
wrong
were,
with
what was
liking raisin
what's the
cakes?
semblant? What's that about? It says they married, he married a prostitute. And they lived in Judah, and they eat raisin cakes there.
Yeah.
Is that like
It
bad?
Talked
or-
like a bad thing,
It
didn't
did.
it? Uh-huh.
Well, it implies that, but I also think it's implying the fact that they had food, all right, and they were
Okay.
eating, and they weren't starving, this kind of thing. But I'll do further. I will do some research.
Well,
Next
it
week,
was
I will
twice.
bring some more information to you about the raisin cake.
It was in there twice, so I feel
Yeah.
like it must be.
Well, there's a
more.
couple of things that fall in there like it. But when you look at Hosea, here we are. He was the son of Beriah. And he was a prophet. And we know that he was a prophet in 753. And he was for Israel, which is the northern kingdom. During the reign of, if you look on that list you have, there's a whole reign of kings that we're going to see at different times. But that's where, when you see it listed, like it says there for the very beginning of Hosea, look how many kings he lists. All right, all of a sudden, those many they were there. So, if you were king, your life expectancy wasn't too long, was it?
No, probably not.
And so that maybe not want to be one, but you look at that and see where they are. But his life and his relationship, when you get to reading about this, and he goes and marries Gomer, and as he was told to do, right? What do you think about that? Being told that you got to go marry this individual.
Well, and not have sex with her. That was the other thing.
Yeah, right.
It was like-
That's
I kept trying to find a reason
Yes,
why he would ask
but he
him to
wasn't going
do
to
that.
either. That's the thing.
Well-
But I decided that maybe it was trying to teach unconditional love.
Yeah.
well,
Could be.
but it's also what they're saying to you who are on there, the ones that are kicking around in here, wondering why that. Well, it was God's way of having Hosea in his relationship with Gomer to say, this is your relationship with God. You prostituted yourselves. You're no longer with him. And we're going to find out he does say in there, you're not my people anymore. And so it's a relationship there. Think about that today. When you and I think on these lines, we're nowhere near what God wanted us to be. When you realize what we've gone to and what we're about and what our world has changed. I mean, matter of fact, the church is not even the same church that all of us joined as children. It's changed.
Sure.
And it's moved in a direction God didn't want it to go. And so bingo. I mean, why do you think the Methodist Church is in a fight right now?
Yeah.
All right, it's, there's some saying this is the word, and others are saying, well, but if he was living today, this is what the word would say. So we've got this conflict. And so Hosea is saying to us, hey, my relationship with my wife, who is an adulteress.
Joey, I didn't know.
Sorry about that.
You know?
We got comments here. But you think about it. I have to admire him. He was going to go do this, all right? And I have an evil mind at times when he says she conceived and had a son, and then conceived and had a daughter, and then conceived and had another son. I'm wondering, by whom?
She might be wondering that too.
Well, but he didn't. He didn't wonder
I
that.
don't mean him, her.
No, he didn't wonder that. He accepted them as his children, and he named them as God told him to name them. And so we're seeing that sort of thing. So when we're looking at this, I don't want us to get too deep into Hosea. We're going to get into Hosea because you're going to have the next 2 chapters on him, all right?
Oh boy.
You're going to have chapter 1 through 3, and then you're going to have 4 through 14. So we're going to really delve into Hosea. But the deliverance, Hosea says to all of us, there is salvation, all right? There is deliverance for all of us. But Joel, think about Joel. Now, Joel was in 835. He was years ahead of almost 100 years, but at least 70 ahead of Hosea. And he brought God's word, came to him, and we know a little bit about him. Joash was the king during that time of Judah. All right, that was in the southern kingdom, and I'll bring it back down so we can all see it here. Somewhere I had it. Oh, there it is. But that's the southern kingdom down here. All right. Now this is Samaria. Do you remember when Christ was going and he left Jerusalem? And you remember he met the woman at the well in Samaria? Well, guess what? You see this red line? Most of the Jews did not go through Samaria. If they wanted to go to Capernaum, they crossed over the Jordan, went up through Edom, and came out of here. They didn't want to cross through this land because the Samaritans were half Jews. They were not whole Jews, all right? But they had the same God, but yet their gods were different mountains. But anyway, that's one of the stories. But this area we're going to find out is going to get destroyed, okay? And we're going to find out all the predicaments that are going to go into it. But then we also look at Amos, and we studied Amos. All of us looked at Amos a while back when we did that study. He was a shepherd. He was from down there at Tekoa, which is way down here, all right, below Jerusalem. There it is, right there. He's from way down here. And where he was prophesying out to, and we find out that he was in the midst of talking to different ones, and he prophesied for Israel, this is Israel up here. Well, he's down here. But he's saying, hey, straighten up. So it's that far about, that we're seeing. It's hard for us to grasp in our minds, at least wrap our minds around where the 12 were and the different times that they were. And we're going to find out that 2 of them were pretty much together. Haggai and Zechariah are going to be at about the same time, and so we're going to see that. But we're going to, here was Joshua doing his thing, and we read all about him and studied him when we did the book of Joshua. And then we're going to look at Jonah, and here was old Jonah. You got to realize where he was. He was from right in here, and this is where he went over and decided he didn't want to go to Nineveh, which is way over there, all right? Because he said, if I go to Nineveh and I save those people, you're going to back off and be good to them. And sure enough, God was, but he didn't want to go there. But we find it that Jonah, God called him. I know where he feels. I know what he feels like. First time God called me, I didn't go. I said, you got to be kidding me. I have other things to do. And then God says, hey, wait a minute. I got your attention now. You played in the wilderness for 40 years. It's time to get where I'm wanting you to be. So, so Jonah, we know about him. But God brought him back. He brought him over, and he sent him to Nineveh. We're going to find out about that as we get into it. And we're going to find out about Micah. How many of you really ever read about Micah? Micah 6:18. We all know. He has told you, oh, human, what to do, and that is to walk humbly with your God. And so that's one of the things that he says to us. But Micah was one of those. He was in an area. You got him on your map there. He was listed down in some areas. But I don't think he's shown. Yeah, he is. He's way down here. He's right down here. So he's this far away, Micah is. And so that's one of the things you're looking at. So here he was. He was 50 years, though, after Jonah. All right? And 50 years afterwards. And it was the fall of Thebes. This area right here is the Greek name for this is Thebes. Thebes. You and I know it as Samaria, all right? But that falls, and he came, and this is going to be in his time, thinking on that, and so we're looking in that area where it's all about. So, and then we have Nahum, which really and truly is from right here, all right? As close as we can figure, just north of the Dead Sea on the east side of the Jordan River. That's as best that we can identify him for being there. And he not only prophesied for Judah, which is down here, but he also prophesied, as Jonah did, for Nineveh. Now he's a different time, 50 years but after that. So we're seeing those kind of things occur. Excuse me. And then we look at, you got on your map, you got Habakkuk there. Most of us have trouble pronouncing that. And it's, and he's one that he winds up, and he's talking to Babylonia, which is an area over in this area, Babylonia. You got, if you would go up higher here, you got Syria, and then you would have up behind that Assyria, and in between that, down in here, would be Babylonia. But it's what you and I would know today as southern Turkey, all right? And that's the area that was in there. So he was doing that, and his reign was 612. So we've already dropped in centuries. Now in the Old Testament, as you go closer, you know, each one of them, the numbers get less and less, all right? Because you're pulling back to the birth of Christ, which is where the calendar is BC, and we now call it CE, which is the common era. But you and I called it AD for all of our lives, but that's where we are today. So Habakkuk was in there. Then we had, probably you've never read any of them, but you're going to get a chance to read him, and that's Zephaniah. Zephaniah he was the son of Cushai. He prophesied in the 640 in those times during Josiah's reign, and his warning was to Judah, to the lower kingdom, right? The southern kingdom. He was prophesying there. And then we have Haggai, who is around 520, and his prophecy, when you start reading it, is also going to be directly to the governor of Judah, right? And it's also going to be to the high priest of Judah. And so we see some things here. And he deals out of the temple and talks about out of the temple in Jerusalem. So we're going to see some of that. You go back and I would like for you to go back in your book where it says Ezra and where it says 2 Kings, and go back and read those, because you're going to find them correlating with the writers of the writings of the 12 minors. And so they're the ones that are in the midst of all this. So we, at the same time, we have Haggai, we also have Zechariah, and they were both prophesying at the same time. But we're going to find that they were both post-exilic. In other words, they were post-exile. They were after the exile. They were back. People were back from Babylonia. They were back, and they were prophesying through them. So as you read those, looking at getting an idea of those 12, what did you feel? What did you find out? What did you think? All of them had an agenda, but where did the agenda come from?
God.
And the thing about it is, it's sort of like I was talking the other moment. You guess they had a 1-minute pause that they could hear God, and God was, talking to them. How many times have you listened? One of the great things we've done when you did the 40 days of prayer, when we've gone through these things, is one of the things is get in a quiet place, set your mind by reading scriptures, and then go into prayer. And when you get through with your prayer, sit down and shut up and listen. And it's sort of like Joy said to me, "Did you hear me?" And I said, "I heard you, but I wasn't listening." And we've done that to God, haven't we? We've said, God says, "Bob, did you hear me?" And I said, "I heard you, Lord, but I wasn't listening." I was at times like Samuel was. Remember the story on Samuel? He was called in the middle of his dream in the night, and he thought Eli was calling him. Really wasn't. It was after a couple of entrances. Eli said, "Go back and lie in bed, and when you hear him call your name again, say, 'Lord, your servant is willing and ready.'" And so you have to be that. So this is where we are. Here we have 12 minor prophets. Not as much writing with them as you find from Isaiah and Jeremiah and Ezekiel. We're not going to see that much writing, but the writing is going to be extremely strong. And it's going to be there. And on your page 9, it gives you a listing. I argued about some of it with the authors on this, and I won't get into great detail about it. But there were parts in it where I would have given it another name, but we'll get into that when we get to that minor prophet, and I'll talk to you about that. But he lists there. I never really thought of Jonah as a dove. All right. He would, to me, he was ready to run. He wouldn't want to be peaceful. But anyway, that's some of the. But think about where they are as you look on page 9 and see what they mean to you. I want you to look at them and grab into it. You folks out there want to say something, hold your hand up and wave your hand so that she'll see you more than I will, and we can hear what you have to say. But then the question is, what did they say? When you read what we've read here, when we think about, just think about it. You asked that question a while ago. The very first thing Hosea highlights, think about it, it sort of parallels, as I said, his relation with Gomer parallels God's relation with the Israelites. And is God's relation with us today. And so we get to reading about this and hearing things about what they're saying. The messages of the 12, they're absolutely, as the authors are correct, they're diverse. None of the situations are the same. But the message doesn't change. The gift keeps giving. And that's what you were talking about, the Word of God. It keeps going. You know, there's the major word, and I think the authors wrote it correctly, and they put it in a capital letter, and that's truth. And that's the major issue that we're going to look at through these 12 prophets as we look at them. They're different ones.
Well,
But they're all... Yes, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
They all heard God. And then they did what we should do today. They acted boldly and carried out what he told them to do.
Are you asking a question, Roger?
If you're talking, you need to turn off your mute button because I can't read your lips through the mask. The other thing is, there are two things. When I first sat down to read this book, was my mind, you know how it goes down. Minor prophets to me sounded like a bunch of geologists working for the coal mining industry, and they were out looking for gold. But that's not what it was. So, but after reading all those passages, and then was there three of them? Two of them said something, or three of them. Every one of the prophets sounded like, if I could use the analogy, they sounded like the 12 quarterbacks using plays out of the same playbook.
That's a good analogy. Yes, that's true. They are using the plays out of the same playbook. Yes, it's a good thought. I hadn't looked at it from the sports side, but that's where it is. And yeah, that works. What do you think? Did you all of you hear Roger?
I did.
Okay, the furthest away said they did. So okay, I'm close, but I don't have my hearing aids in because guess what, Roger? These things pull them out. Every time you take them off, your hearing aids go flying out. So that's what it. But when you look at this and think about it, here was when it was given a passage that you had a little passage from each one of them to read, and you know this coming with Hosea and with Joel and all of them. What it goes back and says in essence is friends may desert us. That's what Hosea was talking to us about. But God will not. In other words, and he did it by talking about the crops. You remember that? He illuminated about the crops, and he talked about God's answering him. But he also talked about what he had with his wife. That was not how can you be? It's sort of like many years ago. I had a friend of mine, a classmate of mine. Matter of fact, he and I have made some of our class reunions, at least the 50th one I think together. His father was a Methodist minister. And LT was just absolutely a marvelous pastor. But I found out later from Brownell, that was his son's name, I went to school together for 12 years. He said every time my dad knelt to pray, my mother would throw shoes at him. Do you guess that's what happened to Hosea? You guess Gomer was throwing stuff at him and yelling? I don't know. I don't know how you are, but I try to read between the lines, and that gets me in trouble. All right? But I try to see what was really transpiring in a household where there was a loving husband, forgiving husband, but an adulterous wife. And I've seen it the other way around too. Don't get me wrong. I'm not trying to put sexual type connotations on it. It's just that the fact is, to me, that's amazing when you realize we're there. So he's talking about some things, and then when you look at Joel talking about locusts.
Yeah.
How many of you remember when the locusts came and we had them just inundating us? You're not old enough to remember that.
Yeah.
You are, and I am, because I remember the locusts as destroying, and that sort of thing. So if you haven't seen that occur to a crop, it's sort of like, do you remember the children's choir from India we had here? And they were all here performing. Do you guys remember them? I know Esther doesn't. She didn't know we were doing that at that time. But do you know why they were here? Their country was inundated. Their crops were inundated by rats.
Oh.
And they were destroying their crops. And they didn't have, so the kids were singing, traveling around, raising money to go back and help take care of their communities. And so it's hard for us to grasp that. But if you haven't seen, my dad talked about he was with Patton in North Africa in the Second World War, and he talked about the locusts being so big that the natives would catch them in sheets and roast them and eat them like you and I eat popcorn.
That's probably better than what else could.
And so, it's hard for us to grasp that. But my dad said the skies would be absolutely covered, darkened almost, by there was so much locusts going in. So you can imagine that. This is what Joel's writing about, and he's telling about it. But he says also the Spirit's available in all of this. So I want us to look at that as we get into those individually. And then there's old Amos, which we looked at in great detail. But we're going to look at him not quite as the detail that we had before. But we're going to look at him because realize that in the very beginning, God is depicted as a absolutely roaring lion. Do you remember that when we were studying and how God was a roaring lion? I was reading from C.S. Lewis's one of the Chronicles of Narnia today,
Oh, I love that.
and it was about what happened with Aslan, and Aslan roared like a lion, And so all of a sudden I'm saying, well, wait a minute, things are starting to make sense. But that's where we are, and that's what think about it. Amos is saying that. This lion is going to devour the unfaithful. If you remember, we looked in the book of Revelations, that's what was transpiring at the very end. All right. And so Amos is there. But he also Amos says, even if he's just roaring like a lion, if you remember, we got further into Amos, we found out that he said, hey, seek God and live. In other words, that's what we have to do. And that's one of the things that we're going to look at with some more detail. And then Obadiah. How many of you ever read anything of Obadiah? It's just one chapter. Yeah. All right. But there's God's judgment will fall on all nations. Oh. Well, what he was talking in his time, but think about it. Is that judgment going to fall on all nations in our time? I don't know. Where it is. I was reading a book that I saw on my shelf, written by Philip Yancey. I don't know if you've ever read any of him. And Joy and I were looking at some of my books in my study this morning because I'm wondering what to do with them. And there it was. Guess what the title of his book is? Disappointed with God. Have you ever been there? Well, this is where they were when Obadiah was talking. They were disappointed. And Obadiah said, if you think you're disappointed, look what God is disappointed about. And so he says, because, he said, I want you to understand that because of how wonderful God is, but how you treated him is not nice. All right? So he's talking even to us today. And there was old Jonah. You know Jonah. He didn't want to go to Nineveh, but in realizing that what he really said was he wanted Nineveh destroyed. It's hard for us to imagine, isn't it? Here was Jonah. Jonah says, wait, well, you don't want to send me to Nineveh, Lord. You need to destroy it. You need to wipe it out. And I'm sure he had in his mind like Sodom and Gomorrah. Boom, they're gone, all right? That was what he wanted, but God says no. He said, well, I'm not going, so you got to jump ship, right? But anyway, so when you look at that, But the really thing is, what he brings out to you and me is, I wanted Nineveh gone, but God had a different thought. And that's what he went, and he did have a different thing. And then we look at Micah. He's one of them we hear. And you remember that in the very first part there, God is he's in charge, so that you and I best walk humbly with him, as he says in the 6th chapter. So God delights in yours and my coming back. And as we find out from Hosea, with what went on in his life with Gomer, then think about it. God is merciful. And that's what we're finding out from Micah. And then there's that little one that you know very little about, and that's, most of you probably don't even know where it, didn't know it was in the Bible till we got to looking at these 12, and it's Nahum, all right? Well, we don't even know where Hosea lived. In other words, that is never in any of his writings do we know where that was. There's an estimate, a thought that maybe he was up in this area up in here, but that's strictly speculation. We didn't know that. But there was Nahum, and you realize that he was saying that God is slow to anger. Well, that's merciful, isn't it? Because most of us fly off the handle in a hurry, right? Matter of fact, I was reading a book, one novel in some of my spare time recently, and that was one of the things that came out. The guy said, I don't know why I didn't fly off the handle, because I normally do. Why am I being so calm? He couldn't answer that either. But what Nahum is saying to you is, God is slow to anger, but he also says he's slow to anger, but look out. He will take just a task. But he says, trust him. And the other thing that Nahum is going to show us, all of this is up to us. God is there. God wants to love us. God is there. You and I, it's up to us to turn around and accept that. And Nahum is going to tell us that as we look at that. And then there's Habakkuk. He knew God was really and truly going to destroy Judah. He was going to wipe this southern kingdom out. He knew it. And he was trying to tell them that and get them to know. And so you look at the 2nd verse, God answers his questions. And when he really comes out that you and I must trust in what God is saying to us. So we must trust in that, and he's saying that to us. And we're going to look at that in some more detail. But the other thing he jumps out to them is during Habakkuk's day, they were idol worshipers. Now, if you remember, they took on what all the surrounding countries did, and they had household gods. They had little gods in their house. And it's sort of like, Joy and I were watching a super little movie yesterday. We get Netflix. No, it was on Prime. It was on Prime. And we looked it up, and it was a lovely story. But in the passage was 2 young people getting to their inheritance in Oregon, but they traveled through the plains and met up with the Indians, the Native Americans, and it doesn't say much about it in the movie, but you see them realizing they are in tune with nature. And so in them, the bird has a god, all right? The eagle has one, the grizzly bear, and so, but when you think about what's transpired with these Israelites, those in the southern kingdom and in the northern kingdom, is they had taken on and having household gods, little idols. And that's what they were worshiping. And so he was saying, idols have no life. It's an interesting comment. We'll get to that when we get into it. But he says, approach God in every way. In other words, reverently approach God in all of this. We're going to find that. Zephaniah is an interesting individual. His most favorite thing is God will disperse the enemy and come live among them. Now, I don't know about you, but that's about the time I want to start singing the Hallelujah chorus. If God is going to disperse our enemies and come live among us, but guess what? we've got to change the way we are. And this is what Zephaniah is going to tell us, is the fact that you and I, we're going to have to do that. And, you know, the great day is very near. He's going to tell us this. Wake up, smell the roses, because it's getting ready to happen. And so you got to recognize your sin, and you've got to flee from that sin. In other words, get away from it. And then we have Haggai. You know, his whole thing was honor God with building. Now, he's talking about building a temple, right, when you look at this. But think about it in another way. We honor God with building what? Ourselves? If we build ourselves spiritually and honor God with what we're doing, what does we say we do? Our mission here as Mabelvale is to make disciples and instruct them and teach them to make disciples. In other words, that's building, and that's the building block. That's the foundation that's built on. We're going to look at that when we get into Haggai more and more, of really looking to what building the temple really is. In other words, is it the physical plant, or is it what comes out of the physical plant? So we're going to look at that. And then Zechariah, who's at the same time as Haggai, believe it or not, when you read those passages, did you read those passages that's listed there? Did you pick up on who he was telling us about? When you look at Zechariah 8:3, he's prophesying the coming of Christ.
Oh, yeah.
And when you read 14:9, there's more on Jesus Christ. So here we are, 500 years before Christ,
Talk about being
and they're talking about the coming of the Messiah. And so we look at that. And then Malachi, you know, let's think about him. Most of us realize it's the last book in the Old Testament. All right. But his big thing was, evil is like a furnace. You like furnaces? This one just cut on behind me, by the way. If you wonder, when I said that, Roger, it cut on. So anyway. But think about it. When you think about a furnace, all of us can think of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego when we think of being in a fiery furnace. But that's really what sin does to us. It's like putting us in a furnace, and it sort of burns us up. And Malachi is going to talk about this. But and the big thing is, he says, follow God. And he's going to tell us, following God is not easy. And when I read that, I'm saying, Malachi, tell me something I didn't know. I mean, I didn't know already. All right? And he'd go on. But really and truly, God is going to be the heaven and the light, and it's coming. And that's what he's going to say to us. So, thoughts? Where were you in all of this? Is this... I have a question of all of you there and all of them here. Is this carrying you too deep into the Word of God?
I kind of said that on the way here, that it's because I think we were looking at all of them at once. It seemed like it was too much.
Well, yeah, if you look at all 12 at once. But you see, the thing about it, Lisa, you play the flute, right?
I do.
And you also know that you can play 12 notes and they become harmonious, right? You and I know that we can take 3 of these and make the right chords, right tones, and make a beautiful chord. And so this is what I'm seeing. I'm seeing minor notes being made into a major chorus. All right, and that's exactly what it's going to wind up being. I think of it musically, because I think of them being minor keys that are going to be pushed up into, so it's a 7th. I don't know, all right? But that's one of the things we look at. And so that's where we are. And so,
Looking at the 12 together has made me more interested in looking at them individually.
okay, Joyce says, look at the 12 together, makes her want to look more in depth to individually. And I hope that's right,
Yeah.
all right? And I hope it works that way for you guys at home in all of this, because it is there. By the way, if you have questions, for those of you that I don't get here, y'all know my email address, so fire away, and we'll see what we can do of answering any of the questions that come up on all this, because I have questions in all of this. I'm screaming at times. I don't know about you, but have you ever screamed at God? Well, there was Jonah screamed at him. Well, if I go there, you're going to save these idiots. And what you ought to do is annihilate them, right? And that's one of the things we're looking at. And so I want us to realize that, but by the grace of God, as we read these 12, there goes us, realizing it when we're there, all right? And where were they? Where were these things? You know, the places of origin, you got them on your map. They scattered. We don't know where all of them were, but that's a good generality on your map of where they were. And look them up and go back and read the text. And your page 11 shows you where they are. You know, Amos was down here from Teacup, all right? That's down here below Jerusalem. And there's a little town right there. And when you look at that, and you look at where Jonah was from, and he was from the north. But the fact where he jumped ship over here was what you and I would call Joppa. Joppa is where he jumped out, but that wasn't the city then. That's where it was. And then there's Micah. He was in the south, and but he did it for both. He prophesied not only for the south, but for the north as well. So he's covering a lot of territory. And then there's Nahum, who was in the south, but he was not only for Judah, all right, this is here, but he was also, how did he get his prophecy to Nineveh? We're going to look at that and realize how far it is from here to Nineveh, way over there in Assyria, all right, and over with southern Turkey today. So there's a long haul. But you look at them, and your authors were giving you some wonderful information. Who's in the southern kingdom? Who's in the northern? Who was in Assyria? Who was in Edom? Y'all know where Edom is, right? It's over here. You know where Edom got its name from? Who was the founder of it? Esau. You remember after he left and he sold his birthright and went off and took off, and he and his brother never spoke again for many years? This is Edom, is where he came from. So that's where it's there. And the interesting thing is, I love what the authors told us, because if you read it, you're going to find it. Nahum and Obadiah never traveled to the foreign nations in which they were prophesying to. How'd they get it there? That's a long haul of the mail service. Esther, you say you got your book today? I don't know if Esther heard me. Esther, did you get your book today, you said? Can you imagine that was from here to there, and I mailed it Monday, all right?
That's a miracle.
And that's a miracle in itself, Esther. Can you imagine how long it took Nahum's words and prophecies to go from down here to Nineveh? How did it get there? Who carried it? Got caravans? I don't know. But the page 12 has got a pretty one. As a matter of fact, I made copies like this. If you don't have them, I sent you one in your book, Esther. But if the rest of you want one, let me know and I'll get it to you. I blew it up and I made it larger and made it as dark as I could, because in the book, it's extremely light to me, all right?
We're talking about reading between the lines. I wonder if Nahum and Jonah were friends.
Maybe.
And by communication.
Yeah, but they were from two different places.
Well, I know, that's okay though.
But Joyce asked a question. Did she think Nahum and Jonah were friends, since they were both prophesying
And
to?
why would he go so far away?
That's a good question. But now if you look over, scan ahead a page, and look on page 14, and it will give you the kings of Judah and Israel, along with the prophets that were there, all right? And Nahum was around there in 642, and where was Jonah? Jonah was over here and 100 years ahead of him, over on the right-hand side there. So they did, unless he lived to be an old, like Methuselah, they probably didn't know each other.
So they were at different time periods.
They were different, 100 years apart.
Okay.
Okay. So that's what it looks like from there.
Good thought, though.
Yeah, it's a very good thought. I agree.
Maybe he was a distant cousin.
Maybe.
But when you start looking at there on 13, if you want the answers to where it's on 13, you can read those individual scriptures like Hosea 1:1, Amos 1:1. All of these are just telling you when it occurred and who was king. And by the way, they don't tell us the year, but they tell us the king. And so because knowing when the kings were And when they were in reign, then we know when the prophets were doing their prophesying, and that's how we got it. And you have all of it there on page 13 as you go through that. And then if you want to look over on 14, and that gives you some ideas of there. Then I get to wondering, and I think they ask the right question, why did they prophesy?
Well, because they were told to.
Because, well, Joyce said because they were told to. Somebody else, speak up. Why did they prophesy?
I think they had something to say.
Well, but who gave them what to say?
Oh,
Yeah.
God called them. God gave them the message that He wanted. It's sort of like, Joyce, you do Toastmasters. You speak a lot, right? Have you ever walked up to be the Toastmaster with ideas of what you're going to say, and when you step up to the mic, you're just like, this is not what I want to say. I want to say something else. Have you ever been there?
Well, sometimes I don't remember what I said.
She says sometimes she doesn't remember what she said.
I wonder where those words came from.
But at times, I've had for me a sermon notes in front of me. Stepped up to the pulpit, and it's like the Lord says, this is not what I want you talking about today. This is not the message I want you to bring. And I said, okay, lead on, O King Eternal, and just let it flow. And that's what's happening here. They're telling to the people that they're prophesying to what God is. It's like Hosea. You would think in his own mind, God called him. And God told him to go marry an adulterous woman. Well, I don't know about you, but I would do some hesitations, wouldn't you? If you were a girl, would you want to marry an adulterous man?
Probably not.
Probably not. So we could look at these things. But that's where it comes from. What did they prophesy?
He didn't argue.
No, he didn't argue.
I mean, we argue with God sometimes.
Of the 12, who argued? Jonah.
Jonah was the
The
only
Jonah, and then Jonah is so human.
It didn't work.
He said, you don't listen to me, I'm gone, you know. And God just sort of grabbed him by the nape of the neck and lifted him up and brought him back. And so that's where we are. But here we are, when you think about it, God motivated all of these minor prophets, and that's why they're there. And that's why they're in the canon. That's why they are here. That's why they were in the Old Testament. The Jews put them in their canon because they knew this, and so it was part of what we are.
And what we're supposed to be careful about is false prophets.
Yes, but the false prophets we're looking at more came about after the coming of Christ, and that's where the false prophets and I don't doubt that they were in this other, but God, we don't find a lot of it in the Old Testament. As my friend says, the left Bible and not the right Bible. And so when you look at this, but think about it. Here was Hosea, had a totally different application of what he was dealing with. All right, all of them did. But all of them had one thing in common, and that was the truth.
they were called.
But they went at it in totally different ways. It's sort of like Joy's nephew took over his business that had been his dad's. He was a graduate construction engineer. All right. Wisa knew all about calculus and how to figure areas and odd shapes and everything. His dad never finished high school and had a very successful business. They were working a job, and he did it one way, and his dad did it another way, and they came out with the same answer, but his dad says, I don't understand a thing you did. How did you get this answer? And he said, well, Dad, I don't understand anything you did. How did you get the answer? So you see what we're looking at, all of them's going to be coming from different directions. 12 different directions are coming at us from the minor prophets, helping us to know what God is calling us to do. Here, they're prophesying to us today in the 21st century. And we're going to look at that as we get on to it. So what did they, why did it? They did it because God said it. And they brought out it. Jonah wound up fulfilling his mission. All right. Micah, he just said, Samaria, which is right here, all your sins are going to wipe you out. And they did. All right. We see all of this. And so you see that on page 15. Write your own notes in, all right? As you read it, put your own ideas. Don't take Bob's, all right? But even down at Haggai, he says, it's well and good for you and me but sitting on our duffs and not building for the Lord is not right. That's the building we're going to be talking about when we get into Haggai and all this. But what do you think of it? So, thoughts about the first